Let's talk about how to make a framed farmhouse sign like this one right here from start to finish. My name's Lindsay, I'm from The Nest Designs, and I'm sharing all of my tips and tricks with sign makers, crafters, and other DIYers. So if that sounds good, hit the subscribe button and leave any comments on what else you'd like to see. For our farmhouse signs, we use 1/2-inch backers made out of birch plywood. We buy our plywood in 4x8 sheets from Home Depot and cut it to size using a table saw and a miter saw. If you don't have access to those tools, you can always buy backers from other small business owners, large craft stores, or things like that. And you want to start by sanding your backers nice and smooth to help prevent any bleeding when you go to add the design. Next, go ahead and paint your backer. For mine, I use bare latex paint. Typically, I do 2 coats of paint to make sure I have really nice coverage, and I sand in between coats, again, to have a really nice smooth surface. While the paint on my backer is drying, I will go ahead and cut my stencil out using my Cricut. For my stencil, I use Oracle stencil vinyl that I buy by the roll. And I have a Cricut Explore Air 2. And if you need any help or advice on how to use your Cricut or cut a stencil out, let me know in the comments and I can definitely make a video about it. Once my stencil is cut out, I will go ahead and reverse weed it, which basically just means I'm taking off the parts of the stencil vinyl where the design is because that's where I want the paint to go through. Then I add on transfer tape. And after one more round of sanding my backer down to make sure it's nice and smooth to help prevent bleeding, I will go ahead and add my stencil onto my backer. Most of the time when I'm adding my stencil onto my backer, I just eyeball it to make sure it's center and straight. But if it's a sign I need to be really perfect about, I will use measuring tape to ensure that it's even on both sides. But honestly, eyeballing it is pretty darn good most of the time. Once the stencil is on, we can remove the transfer tape. And then I'm going to paint over my stencil first with white paint because it is the same color as the backer. And this is another super important step when it comes to preventing bleeding on signs, because if there's any gaps in the stencil or any areas where paint might bleed through, when you add the white paint first, the bleeding is done in white paint, so you can't see it. So now when you go ahead and add your black paint to add the design on, it won't actually bleed through because the white paint that you added first will actually block the black paint from bleeding. And if you use this method to help prevent bleeding, just be sure to use the same type of paintbrush to paint in the same direction and to use, in general, the same amount of paint between the white and the black, because otherwise you could risk some bleeding. For black paint, I use a Rust-Oleum latex paint, and I'm not gonna lie, it's not really my favorite. I don't think the coverage is very good, but it's the only black paint in latex form that I can go to the store and just buy, so it works okay. Once your paint is dry, go ahead and remove your stencil, and I really do recommend waiting until your paint is dry to take your stencil off. And you can go ahead and pull your stencil up while the paint is still wet. Some people actually recommend that. For me, there's just more risk with that because if the paint has started to dry at all, then you risk pulling the paint up. So if you just wait until it's completely dry, you won't have that issue. Next, we're gonna start working on the frame of our sign. For frames, I like to use either common pine 1x2 or select pine 1x2, and then cut it to size using a miter saw. Select pine is really great because it looks very nice and very finished, and you'll have a very clean looking product. However, it costs about 6 times more than common pine does. And common pine, it is a lot rougher around the edges. You're definitely gonna wanna sand it or plane it before you use it, but it can work really well. It's actually what I'm using right now, and I do really recommend it, especially if you make a lot of farmhouse signs. I also went ahead and stained the frame. I'm using a red mahogany by Minwax, and I really like Minwax stains. Once the stain is dry, we're gonna go ahead and frame it. And for framing, I use a Ryobi battery-powered brad nailer. And I really like it. The battery-powered brad nailers tend to be a little bit clunkier than the brad nailers that run off of air compressors, but I use my brad nailer mostly indoors where I didn't have space for an air compressor, so this works really well for me. And I also use wood glue to help keep my frame on, just to make the frame stronger and to ensure that it holds. And my favorite wood glue is by far Gorilla Wood Glue because it holds really well, but it also dries very clear. And not a lot of wood glues do that. I've used other wood glues that dry yellow, and if I have any excess that gets onto the front of the backer where the design is, it actually dries yellow and it's really tough to get off, and I don't have that issue with Gorilla Wood Glue. And one of my best tips for framing signs is to avoid brad nailing into any knots. This is because the knots of the wood are hard spots, and so if you try to brad nail through it, it could push the nail either through the front of the frame or the back of the frame and potentially ruin your sign. And if you aren't careful and the nail shoots through the front or the back of the frame, it could actually shoot into your finger. And I've done that before, and that really sucks. So just don't do that. Once you are done framing, your sign is done and should look something like this. Feel free to leave any questions in the comments.